Welcome to The Application, the podcast series from Saïd Business School, featuring some of the extraordinary personalities who were offered a place on the Executive MBA here at Oxford University. I'm Kathy Harvey. As Associate Dean, I've been involved with the people who've embarked on this journey for over half the 20 years since the programme was established. This is my chance to reconnect with them and to hear more about their struggles and their achievements, personal and professional, and to learn the leadership lessons we can all take from these inspiring alumni.
There is a lot of stress in running your own business, and some people deal with stress okay, and some people don't. If you're the sort of person that doesn't deal with stress okay, steer well clear of running your own business unless you've got billions in the bank and you don't mind losing it.
I'm delighted to be joined today by Patrick Grant. Patrick is a serial entrepreneur, a menswear designer who's owned an exclusive tailoring brand, a ready-to-wear men's brand, and now a social enterprise called Community Clothing, which is dedicated to reversing our addiction to global fast fashion. Patrick's best known in the UK for his appearance as a judge on the BBC television series The Great British Sewing Bee. But I want to start by focusing, Patrick, on your career as a serial entrepreneur, because I think that started at Oxford when you were in the very first class in 2004 of the Executive MBA at the Saïd Business School. Can you take us back to that point, to when you first had the idea of buying a Savile Row tailor?
Well, yeah, I can. I mean, it probably started before that, actually. I mean, I remember running a toast business at school, which interestingly kind of predated Stelios's price elasticity model with EasyJet by about 15 years. But yeah, it certainly wasn't something I'd planned. And it came about by accident. Actually, a friend of mine who was in the cohort below us was supposed to meet me for lunch in typical fashion, stood me up. And the undergrads had nicked all the papers at New College. So the only paper that was left was an FT, which, given that I was a business student, weirdly, I didn't read that often. But in the back of the paper, on that one day only, was a little advert. And it was in the businesses for sale section, which is not a section of the paper I'd ever even seen before, let alone read. Yeah, and on that one day, there was a little postage stamp size advert that said, for sale, tailor to kings, emperors and presidents, or something along those lines. And it said, write to Mr. N. Granger at this address. So I frankly couldn't quite believe it, but I wrote to them and started a conversation that 8 months later led to me buying this old business.
What made you interested in that business?
Well, I'd always had an absolute fascination with old businesses. Right back to when I was a teenager in Edinburgh, I always really liked the stories of some of these old brands. And, I'd always also loved clothes, and I was a fanatic about clothes. And, in my teens and my 20s, it was either rugby or clothes were my two great fascinations. And in my 20s, it was only clothes. And I'd always also been really interested in quality and craftsmanship and handmade things. And as a kid, I'd always saved up and bought one good thing rather than buy 10 inexpensive things. And the house I grew up in was filled with old but well-made things. And so, if you sort of drew a Venn diagram of the three things that really interested me, storied brands, clothes and craftsmanship, and right in the center of that, of course, is Savile Row. And this was an old brand that was sort of unspoiled. It had never really done anything apart from make bespoke clothes. It was 186 years old at the time. It was in a fairly poor financial position. It had fallen on hard times for various different reasons that I won't go into. But at its heart, it was an amazing little business that, I felt could be brought back to good health without too many complicated or difficult things. The previous owner had sort of shied away from the smallness of it. And I thought it was one of the things that was great about it was that, we only made a couple of hundred suits a year, and we made them all by hand in a tiny workshop in the back of the shop. And I felt that was its great charm. And the other really important thing that I did was that I re-established a very clear narrative for where we sourced all of our fabrics. And I think I was, I know I was the first person on the street to say, look, we only use British fabrics in our suits, if they are available. So, of course, every suit that's made on Savile Row has its own interesting story because of the way it's cut and sewn and the people who cut and sew it and their stories and this lineage of tailoring that stretches back 700 years in London. But more than that, I wanted to connect with all of the amazing places across the UK that made the cloth that went into those clothes. Because again, Britain's history in cloth production is incredibly rich. And we still to this day make the best woolen cloths in the world. And some of those mills have just got amazing stories, and our customers loved all of that.
We've leapt on, of course, and I can hear in your voice, Patrick, I can hear your drive and your passion for that business. But you hadn't run a business before you answered that advert in the Financial Times and decided to buy it and take it over. So how did you make that leap? You were working as a marketing executive in, I think, an optical components firm. You'd done a material science degree. So give us a bit of an insight into how you made that leap.
Well, as I said, I'd run my toast business back in school, and I had a decade of experience working for 3 big and well-run businesses. So I'd had responsibility of looking after, most aspects of running a business, but I'd never done it myself, and I'd certainly never done it in clothing. But the great thing about a Savile Row Tailors is it's quite a straightforward business. Somebody walks in, they order something, we make it in the shop, and they pick it up and pay for it and take it home. And that's quite straightforward, really. You've just got to get enough people interested in what you do. And, the advantage that we had was that we were on a street that's world famous for doing what we do. And the disadvantage we had was that all of our neighbours were the very best in the world at what we do. So, it was just a question of understanding what was special about Nortons and communicating that well and running the business by establishing a blueprint for Nortons that was all about just doing a great job of bespoke tailoring. We became a place that other tailors on the street, thought they might want to work at. We set up very much as just a bespoke house, and people liked what I stood for. So I was able to recruit some good tailors and good cutters to the business. And that was really the great challenge, was just get the product to a point where it was as good as it could be and tell the story. And that's what I did.
You had some pieces of luck as well when you were running Nortons. I think you ended up producing something for Christian Dior. And then, of course, someone spotted you and your passion for talking about clothing and quality clothing, and you ended up on television as a presenter. Entrepreneurs often know how to make the most of their luck. Tell us a little bit about how you did that.
Well, yeah, almost correct. I mean, we did have 2 fantastic bits of good luck. And those were, firstly, that a young designer called Kim Jones, who is now the creative director of Dior and Fendi and has been the creative director at Louis Vuitton, and before that was Dunhill. But at the time, he was an emerging designer in London running his own collection. And he liked what we did and came to the shop and hung out and looked at what we did. And 6 months later, he got in touch and said, could we make some things for him, which we did. And he was very generous about telling the world that he'd worked with us. And through him, we ended up making for the great Alexander McQueen. And we became the tailors in London that the young London fashion scene went to. And the other bit of good luck we had was that the BBC decided to make a documentary about Savile Row about 6 months after I got there. And Ian Denyer, who was the producer director of that series for BBC4, he and I got on really well. And I took him to Harris with me on a cloth sourcing tour, and he got some amazing footage. And we ended up getting far more coverage in that series than we probably ought to have done, given our relative size. But that was a huge boost for our business. Overnight, more people came to the shop than we'd seen in years before. And as a result of that, later on, I ended up getting a job for the BBC as a judge on the Great British Sewing Bee. We get an audience of nearly 6 million people watching this show about sewing, which of course doesn't hurt the profile and doesn't hurt the sales of the businesses that I run.
You make it sound easy, but you also had your failures and your difficulties with Norton and Sons. And then, of course, as time went on, as you developed your next business, which we'll talk about in a minute, tell us about some of the difficult times and where did you go wrong, Patrick?
Well, we had difficult times from the start. I mean, I took the business over with very little money. In order to buy it, I sold my own house and I had a second house. And so I mortgaged one, sold one, mortgaged one, sold everything else, borrowed some money from some friends and family, got some investment actually from another EMBA student in the year below, and some friends, the usual friends, family, the 3 Fs. I won't say the third one because none of them were fools. We didn't have a lot. We bought the business and we kicked off with probably less than 10 grand in the bank. And we were never more than a month away from running out of money, and sometimes we were days away from running out of money. And the first summer, I took the business over in December, and in the August of the following year, the door to the shop only opened once in an entire month, and we ran out of cash. And fortunately for me, Lloyds Bank were reasonably good about it and extended our borrowing just a tiny bit, and my mum dipped into her savings and lent us a little bit, and we managed to get through it. But, as a business, we were never far away from running out of cash at all. And, I don't think I did anything wrong, apart from just not having deep enough pockets. And there was not really very much I could have done about that. But as a business owner, you have to learn to be resilient, and you have to learn to deal with the stress of it all. And, and there is a lot of stress in running your own business, and some people deal with stress okay, and some people don't. And I just, if you're the sort of person that doesn't deal with stress okay, steer well clear of running your own business unless you've got billions in the bank and you don't mind losing it. So, I think that kind of resilience, you either have it or you don't. I had always been resilient in all of the businesses I'd run before. When things had gone wrong in other businesses, I was the sort of person who would say, right, okay, well, we just have to fix all of this. It's gone wrong now. How do we get out of it? And I think you've got to have a pragmatism, and you've got to be a little bit dogged, and you've got to not mind doing all the really crap jobs, because oftentimes, you can afford to hire a certain number of people and they will do certain bits of your business, but all the odd bits and bobs that come along that you don't plan for, you have to do all of those. And, I was doing the bookkeeping, I was ordering the stationery, I was managing the operations, I was doing the marketing, I was doing all of it. And when the plumbing failed, I was mopping up the workshop on New Year's Day. And, that's just how you have to do these things. And I paid myself almost nothing. I used to do a lecture where I talked about living on £1 a day lunch budget. I got very good at working out the specials at Sainsbury's on Berkeley Square. And that was the reality of it for several years. I mean, some entrepreneurs are phenomenally lucky and they have a product that sails away and cannot be beaten. But for most people I talk to who run their own businesses, you are like the duck on the pond. It all looks serene and lovely on the surface, but underneath you're paddling like Billy-O.
That resilience and that need to paddle under the surface was definitely tested when you moved into a different phase of your career and you started community clothing. And I think there, particularly throughout the years just before and during the pandemic, you had a very, very tough time. Can you say something about what Community Clothing does, and then tell us about some of the difficult decisions you had to take then, because you had to make people redundant at one point, and that isn't a story that comes across as easily optimistic for anyone.
Well, the truth is we've been through all sorts of difficult times in all of the businesses. And, I had a huge business with Debenhams that was turning over nearly 28 million pounds a year. And it went bust overnight when Debenhams went kaput. And, Debenhams owed us a lot of money, huge amount of money, which we're not getting anything back from. So Norton & Sons was a success. We took the business from losing a lot of money to making a good, steady profit year on year. And it took about 3.5, 4 years for that to happen. But I was encouraged a lot by various people to look at doing some ready-to-wear clothes. And so I restarted an old brand called eTorts. And that introduced me to a network of incredible factories across the UK that did everything from make socks to jumpers to fabric manufacturers and all sorts. And we sold that brand all over the world. And on the surface, it looked terrific, but it never made any money. And in 2015, one of the factories that was supplying to us, and they were making our 2 best-selling products, I got an email on a Sunday night saying, "I'm really sorry, but we're shutting the factory down." And I wrote back first thing the following morning and said, "Look, what can we do about this?" I'd spent a long time working with this factory. They were amazing at what they did. They were a factory that had been in Blackburn since 1860. They were the last of the Victorian businesses in a town that was built on textiles. And I felt that it was too much to bear. So I bought that business. At the time, I had the money to do it. And I felt there was a gap in the market for quality clothes that were affordable. People wanted to support British manufacturing, but they couldn't afford to. There were dozens and dozens of amazing factories that were crying out for work. And I thought, well, that seems like an obvious place to do something. And so the idea behind Community Clothing was born. And that business has very simple aims. We want to do 2 things. We want to create and sustain jobs in the British textile industry, and we want to make and sell affordable, high quality clothing. And that's kind of a simple proposition. And in order to do it affordably, we had to basically rejig the entire business model. So we kind of turned the model on its head and decided that it was enough just to make a good product and sell it at a good price. We didn't need to spend huge amounts of money marketing it. The world of fashion has decided pretty much in its entirety that what it thinks is the important thing to do is to sell clothes really cheaply and to not worry about the quality of them, and instead to supplement that with increasingly kind of expensive marketing. And we're sort of flying in the face of what the rest of the world is doing in clothing. But the truth is it's working.
It's working now. And I know you're really passionate about creating meaningful jobs for young people in manufacturing. Perhaps we can talk about that in a minute. But I know that during the pandemic, things were very, very difficult.
Atrocious.
Can you say a bit about that time? Because it was an extraordinarily difficult time for so many businesses, and particularly for an organisation like Community Clothing, a social enterprise.
In a funny way, actually, for Community Clothing, it wasn't a bad time because that business was 100% online. The great problem that Community Clothing faced was that most of the manufacturers that we work with, and we work now with 45 manufacturers across the UK, most of those manufacturers either were closed down or pivoted over to making PPE. But our sales went up because we were a pure online player. Norton & Sons was buggered because we were 100% real life, in person, and we were shut down because of the various shutdowns for 9 months. So we had no income at all. And we were lucky. We got a bit of relief from our landlord, but everybody had to be furloughed and people had to live on absolutely the minimum. We couldn't afford to top people's wages up to their previous levels. We had no more money. And, that was incredibly difficult. And for Cookson and Clegg, the manufacturing business, we switched over to making PPE.
And you went on a bit of a crusade at the time, saying, everybody should be able to get their sewing machine out and make protective clothing. And you said at the time that you felt you were banging your head against a brick wall from policymakers who just didn't believe that this kind of thing could happen.
Well, it was I know that, there are about 1.5 million sewing machines in the UK dotted about in homes. And at the time, there were loads of factories that were able to cut out the product. And we said to the Cabinet Office, look, provide the fabric, we'll cut it out centrally. We'll issue it to everyone who wants to help. And there are hundreds of thousands of them. But they said no. They said it doesn't conform to health and safety. And we said, are you taking the utter pee here? We're in the middle of a pandemic. But they said no. And, we had to abide by that. Anyway, we were making scrubs in our factory and supplying them into the NHS. But, I was enormously disappointed because hundreds of thousands of people literally wanted to help and were able to help, and they were denied the opportunity to do that by the government. But a month or so later, we got a call back saying, oh, shit, we're a bit short of masks. Do you think, what you suggested you would do with scrubs, do you think you could help out with masks? And I said, well, of course we can. So we got involved in a project that was all called the Big Community Sew, that was about mobilizing individuals in their homes to make face coverings, improvised face coverings for their friends and family and neighbors. And it was enormously successful. Well over 1 million face coverings were made by individuals and given out for free to people in their communities.
Well, it's the typical Dunkirk spirit. And I think, I can tell that you just have the technique to tell that kind of story in a way that's quite inspiring. And I'm sure that's been part of your success, Patrick. I just wonder now, what's your ambition for community clothing? You're writing now about your views of manufacturing, clothing manufacturing. You're publishing a book called Less, I think, which talks about the need for us all to move away from that fast fashion idea. Where does community clothing as a business now fit into your future?
Well, I want to make community clothing a long-term, stable business that continues to do what it's doing for hopefully the rest of time until we stop wearing clothes. And the ambition is fairly straightforward. I mean, as I said a moment ago, we want to make good quality, affordable clothes that are going to last a really long time. We want to make them in a way that causes no harm to the planet. But more importantly, by doing that, by making clothes locally out of good stuff, and by encouraging consumers to have fewer, better things, we think we can create a lot of jobs. If we replaced large numbers of low quality clothes with small numbers of high quality clothes, and we made those things locally, we could reshape our economy, or certainly a large chunk of it, around making stuff again. And even if the numbers were a lot smaller than they were in the past, every little helps. And we think in our business, directly, if we are successful, we could create 5,000 new jobs directly making stuff for community clothing if the brand is reasonably successful. But moreover, I think there is an opportunity to recreate probably close to 500,000 jobs in the textile and clothing manufacturing sector. And that's my ambition.
So nothing too small.
No, but why? Why think small?
Well, I think small, that's true. Your enthusiasm and your optimism are really contagious. But I just wonder what you saw along the way as the best piece of advice that you received that you would want to pass on to somebody else.
I mean, personally, just try and be nice to people. That seems like a good thing. In fact, the New College motto was manners maketh man. And I see that as be nice to people. That's how I interpret that motto. And strangely, that same motto is on the stained glass in the porch at my mum's house. So that motto has been sort of fed into me in two different directions. But I think it makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of people in business do not care enough about other human beings. And that is a big mistake. I think business has an opportunity to do a lot of good stuff for others. And when I was at Saïd, the Skoll Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship was relatively new. And social entrepreneurship was, in the early 2000s, was a huge talking point. And it was, it felt like there was a great deal of momentum behind the whole sector. And I think the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 and the recession thereafter did a lot of damage to that movement. And I think we need to get back to re-establishing that as a very fundamentally important part of the way business operates. We in this country and in the US have a particularly toxic and sort of inhumane version of capitalism, which many other countries do not have. And in many other countries, business is doing much more for the good of the broader community rather than just for its shareholders. And I think that is a fundamental importance. Anyway, so be nice is one thing. But I think from the business side, I think the most important thing is to understand whether your business really, really does something for people. It's very easy as an entrepreneur to think you've got a great idea, but you have to take a bird's eye view at it. If a business is going to succeed properly, I think it needs to have something that fundamentally addresses a genuine need amongst its intended consumers. In my industry, there is a growing backlash against the sort of crapification, of our world. And I think the next generation of entrepreneurs should only be doing things that they know are going to do good for people and the planet for the entire duration that they want to run their businesses. And if they're not doing that, they want to have a good think about it.
When you applied to study at Oxford back in 2004, we asked you to talk about yourself, your ambitions, what you wanted for your future. What would your application form for the future say now?
Well, it's my birthday today. I'm 52 today. I reckon I've got at least 20 years of doing this. And I'm lucky. And I talk about this in my book. Work is important. We all need work that we enjoy. And for many people today, work has become unfulfilling and meaningless. And I'm very fortunate. I've got a job that gives me enormous satisfaction. But I think as entrepreneurs for the next 25 years or 50 years, we have to be thinking about this world of work. The UN talks about sustainable development goals. Goal 8 is good work for everyone. And we often think that all of this is aimed at the developing world. But the developed world has a huge problem because it's moving a lot of its previously valuable work elsewhere, and it's done so without really thinking about the consequences. That's my feeling. So yeah, I'm just going to carry on. I'm carrying on doing what I'm doing because I like it and it makes me happy.
Happy birthday. It has been a fascinating conversation. Patrick Grant, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to The Application from Oxford University's Saïd Business School. You can catch up with all our episodes wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to know more about Saïd Business School, take a look at the Oxford Answers section on our website, or check out the programme pages for more inspiring stories about our Executive MBA alumni. The Application is produced by Philippa Goodrich and Oxford Digital Media. I'm Kathy Harvey, Associate Dean at Saïd Business School. Thank you for listening.